Good day, everybody. My name is Mike Missinelli, and you are listening to The Coldest Murder, a true crime podcast that I have started with my partner, Vince Molo, who's up in New York. I am back down in Philadelphia. Hello, Vince. How are you today?
Doing great, Mike. I'm really excited about this episode.
In this episode, if you've been following along, we will get into the story of who Carolan Dockerty was, which we really have not introduced yet. We've introduced the murder and we have introduced the suspects, and we will go deeper into the lives of one of the suspects again today. But let me give you a little genesis of this story and how it's personal to me. This murder happened when I was 7 years old. Carolan Dockerty was strangled, raped, and murdered in a church loft in a church, Catholic church around the corner from my house. I was outside playing football with my brother when my mother came running out to shoo us into the house because she had been notified by the Bristol Borough police chief, whose name was Vincent Faragelli, who happened to be my uncle, that there was a murder in the neighborhood. And so the shockwaves of that really stuck with me for a very long time. And there was one thing that also stuck with me. I was an avid reader of newspapers, and I told this story to J.D. Mullane, who was our guest last week on the show, and he actually interviewed me a few days ago. And he said, "What stuck out to you?" What stuck out to me were headlines in the newspaper. I remember vividly when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, seeing a big monster headline, Kennedy assassinated. So the same effect that this had on me when I saw the headlines in the Bristol Daily Courier the following day, even though I may not have understood the day of the murder, why they were shooing me in. I noticed that the headline the Bristol Daily Courier said, "Police press hunt for girl's killer. Father finds child's body in church. Carol would stop to pray at church. Police vow to get him, get the sex killer." All these little headlines, including reconciliation services held at St. Mark. So this became a major story and had a major impact on me. Where there was a picture on the front page of the newspaper of Carolan Dockerty with her bicycle. It was that bicycle that was the indication that she had gone into the church, and that's where she was raped, strangled, and murdered. Of course, we talked about the priest at St. Mark's being a major suspect. His name was Joseph Sabatish. And we'll get more into this in a second. If you've been listening to this podcast, you know that we have given you enough detail for you to probably conclude that maybe it was the priest who did this. But hold on, because this story has many tentacles, and we're going to go over them as much as we can. But today, Vince, I want to focus on who Carolan Dockerty really was. And from the people that I've talked to, and I did not know her. She was 9, I was 7. We didn't go to the same school. She went to St. Mark's Catholic Elementary School, which was on the same street in Bristol Borough that St. Mark's Church was on. But what I could find about Carolan Dockerty is that she was a normal 9-year-old kid, completely unfettered by the life's problems. When you're 9 years old in the early 60s, your life is pretty simple. And so the students that were in her class knew her as a very happy-go-lucky girl who would ride her bicycle around town. In fact, the bicycle was a white Londoner brand bicycle that she would drive around town, and she was noted for this white bicycle she drove around town. Um, she had a basket on the bicycle, and in the basket there was a book that she was returning to the library. She never got to the library. She stopped at the church first and went in to say a prayer because the little girls at St. Mark's and the little boys at St. Mark's Elementary School were told it was a good idea if you pass the church to go in and say a little prayer for your family or whoever. The book was called The Spirit of Fog Island. It was a Judy Bolton mystery, which really had some symbolic tones in the book, which makes the story a little more eerie. Um, in the book, a character says, "Can't you feel it? Haven't you felt it ever since it started? It's the fog and the mystery behind it." Um, just talking about that makes me sad. So I tried to talk to as many students as possible who knew her, who can give me a description of what she was like, but also described the aftermath of what it was like in St. Mark's School after the news came down that she had been raped and murdered. I talked to three of her classmates, and I will name one of them. One of them is named Mary Ann Neppa, who I had a long conversation. Mary Ann Neppa had originally agreed to talk on this podcast, but the girl she was with that day was a better friend of Carolan Dockerty's. Her name was Jane Burke. And the story of those two is rather, I would say, eerie. Um, they spoke on the phone together a couple of days ago. Jane Burke was very distraught about bringing this whole thing up again. So she declined to be on the podcast, and convinced Mary Ann Neppa also that maybe it wouldn't be a good idea because this would dredge up some terrible memories that they've carried for the rest of their lives. So, as the story goes, Jane Burke and Mary Ann Neppa were waiting at the library for Carolan Dockerty to arrive to return this very book, The Spirit of Fog Island. When she did not arrive at the library, they figured maybe something was up. They rode their bicycles down Ratcliffe Street from where the library was located down towards the church. That is where they saw her bicycle out in front of the church. It was described to me by Mary Ann Neppa that they looked at the church and decided they might want to go in the church since Carol Ann's bike was there and maybe she was in there saying a prayer. But something stopped them. And one of the things that stopped them was they realized they didn't have any headdress to go into a Catholic church. Uh, Females at the time were required to wear a headwear as they went into the church. She said they didn't have any headwear. They tried to put a tissue on top of their head, which kept blowing away. But as they were out in front of the church, Mary Ann Eppa told me that she was hit on the top of the head by some kind of a fragment that she thought would maybe be a branch or an acorn or something. She was hit on the head by what she called some kind of debris. She said she looked up at the church, and St. Mark's Church has a very tall steeple, and in that steeple is the choir loft, and it has three louvered windows. She said that when she looked up, she saw one of the windows open and they normally weren't open. So the conclusion, or maybe just the supposition of that, is that the killer may still have been inside. He may have been in the church loft and he opened a window maybe to glance out to see if the coast was clear, and debris from the windowsill came down and hit her on top of the head. Vince, your reaction to that?
It's like it's like it was written for a movie. It's an omen. It's a sign. Is it the hand of God? Keeping them away from the danger that Carol Ann was facing at that moment or already suffered from. Um, uh, I think with things like this, we look for signs, and I reckon to this point, at some part of in Marianne's head, that if it may feel that way. When you talk to her, does she feel that way as well?
She has carried, she told me, a lot of guilt throughout her life because of this, as did her friend Jane. That they were, they always look at it like, well, maybe something could have been different had we gone in the church. And as a 9-year old, you don't really process it. But when you get a little older, the trauma of this, and I don't know how many people who are listening to this have experienced a death of somebody their own age group or somebody that was very close to them at that age. It does leave a mark because you can't really perceive what death is when you're 9 years old. This was as close to death as they could get, where a little girl who was their classmate would not be their classmate anymore. And so the processing that for a lot of years has to be tough on these ladies, which is one reason why I said it's perfectly fine if you don't want to come on. I don't want you to relive trauma that would stir up more trauma as you try to live your life. And it was clear to me that these little girls were very traumatized by this whole thing, and it continued. The trauma continued because once the news broke that she had been murdered, there is an aftermath to this story that they had to deal with, and the aftermath is the police investigation. So we're talking about now police interrogators, whether it was the Bristol police, whether it was state police, or whether it was the FBI, which also came to investigate the case. Each of the boys and girls in that class was pulled out of class one by one and being asked about what they could have possibly known about what happened. Now, one thing I will tell you is that I have been told that St. Mark's did have school the next day. So this murder happened at 4:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, excuse me, Monday, October 21, excuse me, October 20th. The next day was a Tuesday. They had class. And she remembered that vividly. And she also remembered that Carol Ann's desk was vacant and it was untouched. And they kept that way for the rest of the school year. I don't know how I would have handled that as the principal of that school, the instructor, the nuns. They decided to honor her by keeping that desk open instead of removing it. So it was a reminder daily for the rest of those students who went to St. Mark's Elementary School after that, that their classmate was gone. In addition to that, I was told that the FBI confiscated the belts of every boy student in that class. Now, I assume if you're a police investigator, you have to turn over every stone. And so that was part of, okay, she was strangled. We don't know what strangled her. Possibly it was a belt. Could it have been some 9-year-old boy who didn't like Carolan Dockerty? They went over this with a fine tooth comb. When you think about it now, it seems overly harsh, but she definitely told me that the belts of the boys in the class were confiscated so they could be examined.
In the aftermath of something so gruesome, trying to process the anguish and the trauma in real time, and now being at that age, and then trying and now having to experience something that most adults would probably be pretty bad at. I can't imagine how this type of crushing blow impacted them in the aftermath of something that was just horrific.
Now, when we talk about St. Mark's Church and we talk about the priest, Joseph Sabatish, we need to include this. He was interrogated as a suspect in this case. It wasn't until several weeks later that he was transferred out of St. Mark's, and then a couple months after that, actually returned to St. Mark's. Joseph Sabatish has been described to me by certain parishioners who were members of St. Mark Church at the time as quote unquote creepy. He had a creepy kind of appearance and he had a terribly checkered past, as we will soon find out. But one of the peculiar things about this, which made police think that he was the killer, was that he never offered comfort to the Dockerty family. The father of the family, Frank Dockerty, was a staunch Catholic who attended St. Mark's Church regularly. He had a confessorial relationship with the priest there.
Mm.
And according to the people at the church, when Sabatish would then give the communion to the parishioners, he could not look at anybody in the eye. So there's that. There's the fact that he never provided comfort to the family, where it was a regular course of his operations as a priest to provide comfort to somebody who would have suffered a tragedy, who was a parishioner at St. Mark's Church. He did not do that. And it was also took a confession from Frank Dockerty, who went into the confessional with Joseph Sabatish as the priest and asked Sabatish whether he would be out of line to think that it could have been a priest that murdered his daughter. Sabatish at that time closed the confessional window. So now, when we're adding all this up, people that are listening here would think that's pretty peculiar behavior and maybe some kind of a guilt-ridden conscience that he would then act like that. Am I right?
I mean, the idea that you would abandon part of your flock in their greatest time of need is incomprehensible. But the more we learn about him, it seems like it coalesces perfectly with the degenerate, reprobate that Joseph Sabatish was.
Yeah, so let's now, because our focus has been more on Sabatish than other suspects. We have named other suspects in the previous podcast. We had narrowed it down to three suspects, Sabatish being one of them, a drunken handyman who was seen inebriated many times around Bristol Borough named Frank Zucchero, and also a man named William Schrader, who was a 24-year-old kid who lived on the street that bordered St. Mark's Church, as did Zucchero, by the way. We have introduced those suspects, and we will get deeper into that characterization. But for the moment, let's look at Joseph Sabatish, Sabatish. Um, a lot of police officers at the time tabbed him as the main suspect. A lot of police officers were certain that Sabatish was the murderer in this. However, they could never get enough evidence on Sabatish, even though he really couldn't account for his whereabouts at that time. And he took a lie detector test, which he had passed. But he was seen on Mill Street, the commercial street in Bristol Borough, in a shoe store. But he could not account for his whereabouts at the exact time of the murder, which seems very peculiar. And also, there was that detail that he had asked the shoe store clerk for the time when he was wearing a watch, trying to create some kind of an alibi. But it gets so much deeper with Sabatish. Joseph Sabatish, between March 1945 and February 1999, when he was a priest, was moved by the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, the Catholic Archdiocese, at least 16 times. He served as an assistant pastor at three Lower Bucks parishes: St. Michael's the Archangel in Levittown, 1957 to 1962, when then he came to Bristol to go to St. Mark's. From 1962, the year of the murder, to 1967, because he had been transferred out and had returned to St. Mark's Church as this whole thing was not being solved. He was also at St. Thomas Aquinas in Croydon from 1974 to 1976. The log of the Archdiocesan files notes that after he left his last church in Bucks County, St. Thomas Aquinas, Sabatish had his priestly faculties restricted, which is what the Catholic Church was calling that at the time, when there were allegations of sexual misconduct or whatever. They would simply move priests from place to place and take their priestly duties away from them under a category called faculties restricted. He was then living in an undisclosed private residence while he had his faculties restricted between February 1976 through October 1979. That period of time, as we will tell you in a little bit, covered a period of time where he was accused of being a sexual molester by a woman who claimed that she was molested by Sabatish when she was a little girl. So now let's get into that. You have the details of his behavior. You have the details of him being transferred from parish to parish. And here are some more details. Um, he was accused by a woman named Stephanie Bartek of Bethlehem of molesting Stephanie as early as 4 years old, when Stephanie Bartek was 4 years old. As it turned out, Sabatish became friendly with Stephanie Bartek's grandmother when he was the assistant pastor at Sacred Heart Church in Bethlehem. He was frequently at her grandmother's house. He even went on vacation with the family to Wildwood. Stephanie Bartek says that she would be taken on trips to the home of Sabatish's mother in Branchdale, PA, a tiny town in Schuylkill County, which is near Bethlehem. She was quoted as saying in an investigation that I remember that house. To the right was a room with a little bed, and he was laying there butt naked in the bed. It was him in the bed telling me, "This is how you show God's love to make him feel better." He'd say, "Don't you love me? Don't you want to show God your love for him?" Now, as you can imagine, this traumatic happening really had an impact on Stephanie Bartek's life. I had converts with Stephanie Bartek. She declined to come on the podcast to relive those accusations that she made public to the investigators in 2016, by the way. So this is a long time after she was actually molested. And I assume that she had a very difficult time living with that. In fact, she said that it messed me up. I wanted to die my whole life. I wanted to die. I made my first will when I was 7 years old.
Oh,
Um, I've known families that have had to deal with sexual molestation. And it is something that, from what I can understand, that you never, never get past. And the trauma and the scars that you feel manifest themselves all the way into adulthood.
so much so that it's not confined to the person either. You see that the ramifications of things like this bleed into every part of your life. We don't live in a vacuum. And so everyone around you is impacted by this as well. In Carol case, hers, she didn't get to live through it. She didn't get to become a survivor. And so the aftermath of her situation not only impacted people in the immediate present, but 62 years later.
Yes. Now, I know this is probably disturbing for people to listen to, but we're just trying to paint some details of a suspect that could be the murderer and could have committed this kind of crime. We had asked J.D. Mullane, who was our guest in our last podcast, podcast 3, this being podcast 4, whether he thought that Sabatish could be the murderer. And what he told us at the time was he looked straight in his eyes, and Sabatish looked back at him with these cold eyes, the cold eyes of a sociopath. So, according to JD, his instincts would be certainly he could have committed a crime like this. Now, let me give you another story. Joan McCrane and her brother Bill
Mm.
were residents of Tullytown when Sabatish was at St. Michael's the Archangel in the early 1960s. I spoke with Joan McCrane, who told me her story. Uh, Joan had convinced me that she had moved on in her life and that she became a successful person, and it's something that she has really worked hard to overcome in her life. She said that she had been molested with her brother Bill when they were parishioners at St. Michael's the Archangel as children. However, a few days ago, Joan McCrane, as I reached out to her, hoping that she could be a guest to tell her story in this podcast, texted me that she was no longer interested in coming on because she had had a fallback, which I assume is some kind of a mental crash. And maybe in thinking about this and the recurring nightmare of this, whether it resurfaces or it doesn't resurface, my assumption is that in her talking with me about this, it resurfaced to the point where she just couldn't go through with telling the story anymore, which I totally understand.
Yeah.
These women that had the courage to speak to me and to share some details of this whole story, I totally respect and I totally understand why they would not want to relive it on a YouTube broadcast.
Ye- I will add to that, Mike, that not only are we grateful, but um, they have helped to paint a picture for us and for the people following along of Carol Ann, in Mary Ann's case, that she's she's not a character in a story. She was a little girl. She was a delightful little girl by all accounts. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and and she and it's easy over time. And I reckon the day that you saw that headline, that massive headline, that she started to fall into a footnote and a character in a story. But she was a real person, and these survivors are real people, and it's good to hear their stories because they're more than victims or part of a dirty person story.
The aim of this podcast, especially this particular episode, was to highlight the fact that Carolan Dockerty was a child who was a living, breathing child who did normal things that a 9-year-old would do. And the object was to get as much information about what kind of person she was. Now, we're talking about many years down the road, and memories are fuzzy and hazy, and who knows how long people had a chance to spend with her to give us details on what she was really like. She was a traditional, happy 9-year-old girl who rode the pride of her life, her little white bicycle around Bristol, which is a town where you could do that. I grew up doing the same thing. Um, she did and does have a younger sister. Her younger sister is her name is Kay. I will not put her last name out there, but she lives in upstate Pennsylvania. She was 4 years old. She was the younger sister of Carol Ann, 4 years old at the time that Carol Ann was murdered at age 9. I have tried to reach out to Kay several times, found her phone number, her address, and I even wrote her a handwritten letter saying that I would love for you to share your memories of your sister because the people that are listening to this really don't know that this was a living, breathing soul. Instead, we are focused on the mystery of who killed her. So I never heard back from Kay, and that again is fine. I respect totally that certain people do not want to relive this story. And the reason why I'm reliving it is because, like these other people, this has stuck with me for a long time. Now, I wasn't molested by a priest, and I don't have the heinous elements that I was just a kid. I was a kid in the town. But this has weighed on my mind for a really long time, especially when the investigation was kind of reopened in 1992. And I would tell when I was in college, I remember telling a lot of my friends about this murder and how it's still kind of in me. And I've always wanted to do some exploration about this. I can't believe that it was a cold case for 60 plus years. I mean, we think of crimes and murders today, and we know they're solved a lot more easily. My personal feeling about this, my personal connection with the police chief, Vince Faragalli, being my uncle, and the torture that he went through.
Mm.
Vince Faragalli was a widower. He had married my grandmother's niece. And so he was at our Sunday dinner table every Sunday. He would come, and my grandmother loved him and kind of adopted him. And he would never talk about this case. You could see that he was tormented by it. He didn't talk about it because he felt terribly about not being able to solve this crime. So all of these elements have fueled the reason why I wanted to do this.
Mike, the vestiges of our youth are supposed to be happy. Sure, they're real and they're going to have different parts, but for Carol Ann, it's horrific, and for folks like Mary Ann and her father Frank and all of her family members, especially the little girls, because they live under the penumbra of survivor's guilt for 62 years to this day, that it impacts them so much, which I understand, that even having conversations with us become impossible.
We will, in our next podcast, explore the whereabouts and the where and hows and whats of the suspect named William Schrader. Um, but for now, I would like to add a little twist to this story, as if there weren't enough twists.
Yeah.
In Hazleton, Pennsylvania, in the year, well, 17 months after the murder of Carolan Dockerty, there was a similar murder in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, which is up in the north. Marisa Chavarella was a 9-year-old girl who also attended Catholic school, and she had been abducted in some form. Uh, they could never find her until several weeks later, when Marisa was found raped, strangled, and also with a piece of clothing stuffed in her mouth, a similar MO to the murder of Carolan Dockerty. The settings were a little different. Carolan was murdered in a church loft. Marissa was found in a trash pit in Hazleton. And this also became a cold case for 58 years. Um, Hazleton is 40 minutes away from Branchdale, where Joseph Sabatish started his priestly duties and where he was born and where his mother's house was. Um, it gets eerier because in 1990, or excuse me, in 1964, there was a PIAA basketball playoff game between Bristol and Hazleton. The game was in Hazleton, which meant that a couple of busloads of Bristol fans went to see the game in Hazleton. So we have two connections here. Number one is the geographical connection with Sabatish. The other is, could it have been someone else who was a resident of Bristol who was on that bus who somehow found time to commit a crime in Hazleton, Pennsylvania that had the same MO as the murder of Carolan Dockerty?
Wow, that is a breathtaking juxtaposition, or something that was running nearly concurrent to Carol Ann's. It's uncanny that both girls are the same age, and I in the at when it happened, it must have brought up not only old wounds or fresh wounds in Bristol's case, but it must have set a flurry of activity among law enforcement, thinking we have a serial killer.
Yes. And so we are weaving our way through this whole thing. This is now a new twist to the story. We have already gone over one suspect who was eliminated because it was proven that he was taking a driving test in Virginia. We tried to eliminate one suspect, Frank Zucchero, as a drunk who had a confession coerced from him, but who had very specific details of how he supposedly committed this murder. We have already given you tons of information about this quote unquote creepy priest who had all kinds of sexual allegations against him and who would make it a habit to buy women's lingerie that he would say was for his wife. And then we have the 24-year-old drifter who came into Bristol and got a job in a factory in Croydon, who lived on the street adjacent to St. Mark's Church. And now we have the Hazleton connection. Mm. So we will leave you with that. And as we proceed, and as I proceed in investigating this, hopefully I can add more details where we get to the point where we can really narrow this down. And again, we've told you from the start that the only way that we are going to solve this whole situation, and I'm not a police investigator, I am not out to solve it. I am out to bring awareness to it so it can be solved by DNA. New methods of DNA are very expensive. And the DNA in this case, in a lot of ways, was mishandled to the point where they have corrupt DNA and they don't have clear DNA, but they have some DNA that we believe, and the authorities that I've talked to believe, can actually solve this case. So for right now, we will leave you with another arm of this story and come back with our next podcast where we get into the suspect named William Schrader, a drifter who came into Bristol, age 24, who lied about his whereabouts at the time of the murder. Until then, thanks for listening to The Coldest Murder. For Vince Mola up in New York, I'm Mike Missinelli. Thank you so much, and we hope you continue to listen to The Coldest Murder. Good night, everybody.